Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to be looking at Unit 9.5, Calls for Reform and Responses After 1900. So it'll be our first day on this topic. Our learning objective is to explain how social categories, roles, and practices have been maintained or challenged over time. And see some skill application hopefully by the end of this as well. All right, this is one of those things where there are a lot of days in this class where the topics that we spend a day or two on are topics for entire courses at the university level. Today's a little bit different because not only are there entire courses on the topics that we're supposed to cover in this day or two. These are entire majors at a lot of major universities around the countries. For example, there are entire majors about simply, studies challenging the assumptions about gender or about race, right? Obviously, religion is multiple different majors that deal with kind of religious movements in the 20th century. These are huge topics, right? Massive topics. So, really our goal today is to just introduce you to a couple of these topics, kind of give you a little teeny bit of foundation of this, and really that is all, right? So, and of course, the best thing to do is take these categories of analysis, like challenges to assumptions about race, class, and gender and religion, and really just kind of be aware of one of these topics. So today we're going to kind of focus in on liberation theology, and then we'll kind of move on from there. Okay. Most of your homework was about global feminism. So since you did have a homework on this, let's kind of do a little quick skill practice here, and let's just kind of look at if you were trying to source this, like what would be one of the best ways you could source this particular document? All right, so yes, feel free to pause and then go ahead and type that up, and that'll be kind of part of what we're doing today, or part of what you can submit for today if you're watching this at home. All right, so let's. When we talk about challenges of challenging assumptions about gender, and we're talking about how social categories are maintained or if they're challenged over time. Sourcing a document like this is kind of a good starting point, but it also kind of brings into play. At the heart of what we're going to be talking about today is. If I'm talking about the topic of, make sure what I'm about to write here is visible. If I'm talking about the topic of, or the category of analysis, my category of analysis I'm talking about is challenging, right? Challenging assumptions, right? Challenging assumptions about, let's just say in this case here, gender, right? So say I'm playing around with this category of analysis of challenging assumptions about gender. What are one of the ways I can do this, right? So one of the basic ways I can do this is, I'm gonna want to seek the marginalization. I'm gonna want to seek the marginalization of opposing ideologies, right, or beliefs. Right. We don't want to seek the marginalization of those. So what does that mean? That means, especially if I'm in a democracy, right? If I live in a democracy, and let's take this topic of the burqa, right? So, what you were just looking at, right? So let's take the topic of this, the burqa. Should the burqa, be required in a society? Should it be allowed in a society? Or is this thing inherently oppressive? And should it be banned in societies? Should you allow this on the beach? Should you allow it in school? Right? Should the burqa be allowed in school? If you're talking about this debate, all right, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to, if you believe in one side or another of this, you're going to want to marginalize your opposition. So what does that mean? That means if we live in a democracy, right? So we live in a democracy, right? You've got public opinion, right? Public opinion, right? Public opinion, and right there's, we kind of have this kind of political center that exists, right? So if you want to win a an ideological culture debate like this, you need to own this center ground, right? You need to own this center ground. So what does this mean? You need to make your point of view, right? You need to make your point of view what is acceptable, right? So what does that mean? That means I need to marginalize, right? So these are our margins, right? You need to marginalize the opposition. All right, so you need to make it seem that anyone who believes in said position is outside of the of the norm, right? They are out there on the margins. So how could I do that? All right, so let's kind of run through an example here, right? How could I do this? I could make an argument that by requiring women to wear a burqa in public, and thus tolerating the use of the burqa at all, is inherently discriminatory against women, right? So, and I could make arguments along the lines that it's difficult to see, hence difficult to move around, independently. So that's so you'll often see men escorting women around, kind of guiding them around. Isn't it in fact inherently discriminatory if a man has to escort a woman every time she goes out in public because she's wearing this article of clothing? That inherently limits individual liberties, right? Civil liberties of women, and is inherently against equality of women. Can women get equal access to education if they are required to wear something that filters their sight? Right, so you are inherently limiting equal access to education. If girls are required to wear this, I can make that argument. I can make an argument that women. I guess I could cite some examples of societies in which the burqa was required by law, and I can cite that women did not have equal access to the courts. And we see connection to the burqa as a result of this. For example, I think it was, and I'm playing off the top of my head here, memory. I think it was in the spring of 2001. Spring or summer, I forget. I think it was in the spring of 2001. I was a New York Times subscriber, and I remember reading an article in the spring of 2001 about a woman who was showing, a few inches of skin on her wrist. I believe she was still being escorted by a man, but, she was still showing a couple of inches of skin on her wrist. And this is when Afghanistan was ruled by the Taliban. So there was a woman who was showing some skin. She was identified in the street as doing so. A group formed around her, and she was eventually stoned to death in the street for her violation of the norms. So I could expand my argument against, right? I could expand my marginalization for support of this, by kind of going beyond the realm of difficult for mobility and not access to education. I could also further marginalize support of this kind of practice by demonstrating, not access to kind of legal justice, not access to the courts, no due process, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anything I can do to marginalize support, right, and then make my point of view the center. Right, this is when you're talking about challenging assumptions about race, class, gender, religion, really from the 1950s on. this is where a lot of the battles are taking place, right? So because a lot of these battles are taking place in democracies, right? In Europe, Australia, New Zealand, United States, right? That's where a lot of these kind of cultural battles are taking place. So a lot of it has to do with this battle over the center. All right. So if you can marginalize your political opponents, you make them to be the extreme. That is how you win this debate in a democracy. All right. So that all being said, all right, let's kind of look at one of the ways in which this is done. Right. One of the ways in which throughout the second part of the 20th century, from the establishment of the United Nations on, one of the ways in which we see the taking of the center, right, by different groups, is by using the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, right? So if we're talking about gender equality, what's number one, right? And these are all kind of layman's terms here, but what is number one? All humans are born free and equal. That's not all men are born free and equal. All humans, which means all men and women and right, all humans, right, are born free and equal. So there is a sense of legitimacy that comes out of this document, right? That if you're trying to take the center, right, you can use this document to advocate for your beliefs, right? Everyone's entitled to all freedoms and rights without distinction to race, color, sex, language, religion, political opinion, birth. Everyone has a right to life, liberty, security. No one shall be held in slavery. No one shall be tortured. All are equal before the law. No arbitrary arrests, trials. Everyone's entitled to a fair trial, innocent until proven guilty, right? So we see this is being used to take the center, throughout much of the 20th century. All right. And there is this air of legitimacy to this document because most countries of the world sign on to this particular document. So, right, there is a kind of increased validity, right, of this document because most of the world, right, signed into the United Nations, which inherently implies, right, they're buying into this belief system. All right. So we'll see. So we'll see. A lot of a lot of usage of this throughout the 20th century. All right. When we talk about challenges of assumptions, there's a whole bunch of different examples, and this is one that the College Board identifies. So if you want to try to contextualize this particular movement, you could start by kind of looking at the United States, actually. Because there is a contextual connection to this movement in the Harlem Renaissance from the 1920s and 1930s in the United States. That then, that knowledge of that makes its way to Paris, where it comes into contact with the African diaspora, and then becomes foundational in challenging the systems of imperialism that were in existence, following World War II. So this movement becomes instrumental in challenging, the imperialist aspects of France specifically, right, and then eventually others. And of course we see some of the foundational members of this organization, and a couple of you have already done case studies on these. So we did those one pagers. About a week or so ago at the end of the last unit. And so I think a couple of these men were topics that came up. So Kenyatta, Nkrumah was another. I don't know if I think it was just those two. Right. So some of you did one pager case studies already, right, on some of these kind of foundational movements, right? That is ultimately behind the OAU, or the Organization of African Unity. So there is a movement in the 1950s, that's commonly referred to as Pan-Africanism. And the dreams of a Pan-African state, a United States of Africa, failed to come to fruition. and probably will always fail to come to fruition, at least in the foreseeable future. However, the establishment of the OAU as a way to kind of combat the kind of post-colonial imperialist pressures of of the United States and the Soviet Union, there is the kind of foundation for for what eventually might become some type of Pan-African economic organization. There is talk, or at least I have heard presented. I think The Economist a few years back did a thing just saying that there is some discussion amongst some groups in Africa to create a Pan-African, or turning the Organization of African Unity into a tariff organization. Essentially what the EEC was, or the predecessor of the European Union was in the 1950s. It was created as a tariff zone to encourage free trade within the boundaries of it, and also enable the individual member states to negotiate with more powerful economies as a bloc. So when the United States tries to negotiate economic deals, or China tries to negotiate economic deals with individual African states, there is leverage that those larger countries have, because they can pit the smaller countries against each other, right? And so there is talk of a tariff zone, to give more kind of economic clout to some of these states. But that's, at this point, it's just talk. It has not materialized. Individual countries are still economically negotiating with major powers. All right. So liberation theology, right? Liberation theology. Right. So this is another way in which we're seeing challenging of assumptions. But in this case here, right? So kind of go back into that kind of blue color, right? So once again, the challenging of assumptions about, in this case here, religion, right? And why is that frozen? That's weird. Let me close that up, and let's try to reopen that, because it seems to be frozen. All right. Close program. All right. So let me reopen that program. I do want to do this. Sorry, I'm not working under the greatest technological conditions here. All right. So what we're talking about here is challenging assumptions about, in this case here, religion, but also I think we need to kind of talk a little bit about race, race, class, because I think this is, if you're talking about liberation, anything, I think you're kind of getting into a larger movement. So all that being said, right, there are some words or phrases to just kind of make you aware of, right? Whenever you see the word liberation something, right? Whenever you see the word liberation blank, right? Whenever you see the word critical blank, theory, right? Whenever you see words like that, whenever you see phrases like systemic, right? Systemic blank, right? Systemic whatever. Whenever you see phraseology like that, verbiage like that, these are generally phrases and words that we associate with what is sometimes referred to as neo-Marxism. It's probably the kind of easiest way, or just kind of new or repackaged forms of Marxism. So just kind of to make you aware of verbiage, right, that is kind of commonly used. So if we're talking about liberation, in this case here, theology, this is a form of Marxism. All right, so just to make you aware, right, because it's always good to be kind of aware of verbiage. And if you're talking about, the origins of liberation blank or critical blank or that kind of stuff, I guess it is important to contextualize this topic, right? And if you want to do a quick little contextualization, you could start off with the Frankfurt School in the 1920s, right? So and I think this is kind of an important, contextualization to understand. Right, so the Frankfurt School, if you're not familiar with the Frankfurt School, this is a school that exists at the University of Frankfurt. However, it is not funded by the University of Frankfurt. It has a private endowment that funds it. And when you talk about the rise of the Frankfurt School, we typically associate it with the post-World War I era, and of course, some of the contradictions in which Marxists in Germany were dealing with after the First World War. Most notably is why the Soviet Union underwent a socialist revolution, why Russia underwent that process, but Germany did not. Why are there so many divisions amongst socialists within Germany? Germany, of course, should be the ground zero for where the socialist revolution should have taken place. So why are all these divisions, right, exist? And how can they better unify socialism or Marxism? What would be a better glue, right, to kind of cement Marxists together and enough so that they can overthrow the system, right? So we see happen within the Frankfurt School in the 1920s a transition of Marxism from focusing on political and economics, right? So Das Kapital and let's move away from economics, as our primary unifying thing for a socialist Marxist revolution, and let's get into the cultural world, the cultural realm. Why ultimately has Western ideology and free market societies, why have they been able to successfully resist Marxism and the socialist overthrow? Because they controlled the cultural sphere. And if you control the cultural sphere, so says the Frankfurt School, then you control the destiny of society. Right? So we see a rise up in the 1920s, this idea of critical theory, right? So critical theory recognized that every theory is a response to an interest. So what are the different interest groups that are out there, and how can they be, how can you culturally weaponize those interests? Initially, they'll focus in on art, right? So art, becomes the focus here. And art, right, according to critical theory, should make people unhappy, right? So the point of art, right, is to motivate people to see the horrors that exist and not dwell on the positives, right? So but it should force you to re-examine your worldview. When you look at who the members are of the Frankfurt School, I mean, if you kind of run down through the list, it's a who's who of 20th century Marxists. I always kind of love this Adorno quote here, right? That the only things that are true are exaggerations, right? So whenever an event happens within the cultural sphere, the question that has to be asked is, does it have critical potential, right? Can it be used, right? Can a truth, not the truth, but can a truth of an event, right, be used for critical reasons, right? What is critical reasons? To criticize the society, and contribute to its downfall. All right, Western society, excuse me, right? So, what kind of art has the potential to be liberating and encourage reflection, and then what kind of sources of media, has the potential, right? So, things that are inherently negative are best, right? So, so focus on the negativity that exists. Anything that presents happiness in a form of contrast with the oppression of the world. So, anything that, anytime you can take, the positivity that exists and then reshape that for a critical purpose, that is a great thing, right? So, if you are happy, then you're part of the problem. If you're enjoying the fruits of your society, of Western society, then you are inherently exploitative, and you need to, that needs to be addressed. Okay, popular culture should not be escapism, should not be sentimental in nature. You should not go to the movie theater and watch a film and come out of there content. Right? That is not what the purpose of culture should be. You should watch a film and feel guilty about how you live your life. You should listen to a song, right? So if there's a song out there in the cultural realm, in the cultural world, does that song have critical potential? Does that song, go against what are the societal norms? If it goes against societal norms, right, then that has critical potential, and that should be exploited. You should expand the reach of that song. Is a song, is a movie critical of society? That those are the kinds of forms of culture that should be exploited, right? So the only things that are true are exaggerations, right? So let's say hypothetically, let's just kind of go back a slide or two. Let's just say hypothetically that that an event takes place that has critical potential, right? An event takes place has critical potential, and let's just say that I don't believe that I don't believe that the trial should happen, or I don't believe that someone is innocent until they're proven guilty. How do I reshape the narrative? Okay, so when you talk about critical theory, right? Let's kind of go back, to what we have here. Critical theory is an attempt to kind of retake the center. So how can I retake the center? I need to marginalize the UN Declaration of Human Rights, right? So how can I marginalize, right? How can I throw onto the margins this idea of the UN Declaration of Human Rights? I can attack it, right? So what are some good ways to attack the UN Declaration of Human Rights? I can say stuff like, this is a Western-based document. These ideas are based in the ideas of John Locke, and who are the primary writers of this and supporters of this? They are the Western European countries. They are North American countries. These are Western ideals, and hence, as a result of that, right, I can marginalize these by saying that these are inherently oppressive beliefs, right? This idea that everyone should be equal before the law, and that people should have access to fair trial, and that you are innocent until proven guilty. I can marginalize that system, by taking certain truths, and I can exaggerate them. And so you could say that democracy is based on an inherently oppressive system because the founder of Western society, John Locke, was himself oppressive. I can take some things that are true and I can exaggerate them to my own ends, right? And I already talked about this in my back in my Enlightenment video. I can take the idea that John Locke was once paid by paid for writing once, in stock shares of a company that that traded in enslaved Africans. Hence, he profited from the slave trade. Hence, everything he writes is now tainted with racism. Hence, this idea of trial and jury. These ideas are now part of the systemic system of oppression that exists. Right? I can take truths. Right? The only things that are true are exaggerations. I can take a truth that supports my narrative. I can ignore. I don't have to actually read, the two treatises, right? I don't have to actually read what Locke says about, issues of race or anything like that. I can ignore all that because what matters is the truth I want to exaggerate for my narratives, right? So when you talk about this kind of stuff, right, when you start talking about talking about this kind of stuff. This is, Frankfurt School, right? Kind of stuff, kind of inspired stuff, right? So kind of, winning the culture wars, reframing debates, right, for neo-Marxist goals of destroying, market society, market-based societies, free market democracies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So one example that we see of this in the 20th century, in the late 20th century, is with liberation theology. Right. So once again, liberation. This is neo-Marxist. Right. So what do we see here? This is a reshaping of if you want to own the cultural sphere, right? In Western society, is there a better way to do this than kind of taking over the message of the Roman Catholic Church? There's over 1 billion people who identify as Roman Catholic, and kind of wrap your mind, right? Kind of wrap your mind around, right? Around the idea that that the Roman Catholic Church, with 1 billion people who are followers of this, could you imagine the Roman Catholic Church, or even somebody who is a prominent Roman Catholic, adopting some of these ideas, right? If you want to kind of culturally take the center of public opinion, this would be a major victory, right? So we do see it attempted in the 20th century, and we see it fail in the 20th century. So one of the major attempts is liberation theology, right? So where we see a mixture of Christianity and Marxist far left politics, and we see a new biblical analysis of poverty through a Marxist lens, right? Through a Marxist lens. So try to return to the earliest days of teachings of the church with a goal of fighting poverty. And the means is to address sin of greed and take the teachings of Jesus about the poor and selectively cut out the parts of the Bible that support what you are advocating, right? So, and it's an interesting mix of political activism, Marxism, and civil rights and human rights. All right. This is when you talk about liberation theology. This is something that as it becomes more prominent, it's gonna seek, or it will come in under the it'll come under the watch of the church in the West, and you're gonna see you're going to see the Catholic Church, coming out against this, right? Theologically coming out against this, when we talk about who the major figures are that we kind of associate, these are priests, right? Who work with the poor. They end up writing a number of books. So Gustavo Gutierrez is one name that we kind of often associate with this. Oscar Romero is another. It was, and these things are still around. These ideals are still around today. I remember it was about 2 years ago. I was at a teacher, professional development meeting here on campus. So it was, it wasn't directed at history teachers. It was directed at all teachers here at Glen Academy. And the presenter was an outside presenter. And they were, I noticed all these quotes from Gutierrez and Romero on there, and the information that they were presenting was liberation theology. I mean, it was straight up Marxism is what they were presenting here at school. So these things are around today. Just because they didn't survive in their current form doesn't mean that they weren't repackaged, right? And so we'll talk about that in a minute. If you're kind of interested in this stuff, in this topic, I just do want to point out a couple of things, right? So just about Gustavo Gutierrez himself, so this is, Peruvian, from Peru, right? Peruvian theologian, a Peruvian priest, inspired by the events of 1959 in Cuba, and then gets together with kind of like-minded neo-Marxists, and begins to develop a critical evaluation of theology, and create a new theology, right? That is in line, right? So so we see this kind of the future of the church and its role in politics and society needs to get reshaped, right? And there needs to be new commitment to action by members of the church, right? So when what we're really talking about here, as far as the major components, is that the world needs to be transformed. Right? The world needs to be transformed. This criticism that the church, they can't just combat the little things. The church needs to be involved in actually transforming society, right? So this theology expands beyond the development, Christian, kind of traditional Christian realm of society, and expands it into different realms, right? So specifically three things: that the church should be representing the aspirations of the oppressed people; that the church should represent the aspirations of the oppressed. Right, so let's just kind of talk about that for a second, or I'll talk about that in 1 second. A second one is a means to look at history. Right, so what is this saying? Right, that the church needs to represent the oppressed, and a new means of looking at history. So what this is referring to, right? So the church should be on the sides of the oppressed, right? Right, the church should be on the sides of the oppressed, right? So the church should be here, right? And historically, the church, according to this theory, was on the side of the oppressor, right? So the church historically, and they cite evidence, has been on the side of the oppressor. And so what needs to happen is the church needs to stop being there, needs to now be here, and it needs to work with the oppressed, right? And to overthrow the oppressor, right? So you're going to take it down to racial lines in Latin America, the criollos class, right? So the mestizos and the mulattoes and your indigenous populations need to rise up and overthrow the oppressors of society here, right? And so this should then be the revolution. Right, and if this looks familiar to you, then it should, because if you're talking about the new way of looking at history, this is the dialectic, right? This is historical materialism, right? This is that historical materialistic view of history that comes from Hegel. And then is espoused by Marx. So if this looks familiar to you, it's because when we did Marxism, we talked about this already, right? So when you talk about any kind of liberation theology or liberation theory, liberation blank, whatever, or critical blank, you're always going to see, right, this kind of dialectical. Right, this kind of dialectical grouping of societies of the oppressed versus the oppressors. These different interest groups that exist. So if we can combine the different interest groups of the oppressed, right, we can overthrow the oppressor. And then of course the dialectic will continue on, right? So this is kind of where we see Maoism, right? When it comes to Maoism never really stopped doing this. Right? Maoism, this is what the Cultural Revolution is all about. Is about keeping the revolution going and just turning different, these, when you talk about these kinds of groupings, you're talking about, different coalitions being formed. And of course, once that coalition successfully, overthrows one oppressor, then they can be kind of different interest groups can then be divided out, and then they can go after each other, right? So continually over and over and over again. It depends on how far you want the dialectic to go. All right. So when we talk about this, this is a means of looking at history. The means is historical materialism. The means is that Hegelian dialectic, right? Oppressed people, destroying the society of the oppressors. And of course, this can be done through reinterpreting the Bible, right? So you can cherry pick the Bible and find forms, find quotes and passages from the Bible that support your argument. Okay, and of course, what are they actually advocating for? Rather than small, ineffective reforms, right? What are the things that we typically associate with the church, right? The church does things like soup kitchens and homeless shelters, and educational outreach. Instead of these small, ineffective reforms, why not go after the systemic oppression that exists within the society as a whole? Why not be part of the change that overthrows society? And even though violence is not actively encouraged, violence can be justified because this is Marxist, and sometimes revolution has to happen. So sometimes violence can be justified, right? These are all things that go against, right? Go against, Lockean-based, right, Western societal beliefs, right? So, nowhere in a Locke-based society, can you make an argument, that that violence is acceptable, right? That a fair trial is not necessary, and that sometimes people are guilty, before they're given their due process. That takes a whole lot of that takes a whole lot of effort to reshape the center to actually buy into that in a Western society, but it can be done, right? It can effectively be done to the point where people do believe that violence can be justified, right? So and of course because critical theory and liberation theory is in that cultural realm, right? So our art will justify this. The art should be confrontational, right? So, what if Jesus was around today? Would Jesus pick up a gun and fire at the oppressors of society? If Jesus was around today, would the state put him in jail? For what he believed, right? If Mary was around, would she have the support of the cartels? Who are really working to help the people, right? So to help the masses. This is kind of classic Frankfurt School kind of stuff. Reaction against it, once it starts to rise to prominence in the 70s, in the late 60s and in 1970s, the Vatican felt the connection between the movement and Marxism is incompatible with Catholic teachings. And right, so Marx encourages class struggle and social disruption that conflicted with traditional order and stability within the church. The Vatican feared that these forms of social unrest and questioning would weaken the power of and influence of the church. You also have a theological debate as well take place here. So you see reinterpretations of the Bible. Well, that calls into question interpretations, right? This calls into question theology itself. And so the question then does pop up: is Christianity more compatible with the collectivization or the collectivism of Marxism, or is it more compatible with the focus on individual actions that we associate with market economics? Right. So this is this does spur a debate itself, and largely what comes out of this is that the Christian teachings are not compatible with Marxism, and it's so they don't just kind of ban it per se. They actually do attack it, from a theological perspective. And by the time we get into the 80s and early 1990s, liberation theology is largely gone, right? Is largely dead, or discredited, right? So, and it's for a bunch of reasons. One is that whole, the theological aspects of it were countered pretty effectively. But you also see just a general decline in Marxism itself in the late 80s and into the early 1990s. I mean, you've got dozens and dozens of different, socialist experiments that happen by the time we get to the 1980s and 90s, and then they all show themselves to be failures. So by the time we get to the mid 90s, Marxism is generally considered to be dead. So critical theories and liberation theories generally kind of go by the wayside, and they still exist, right? They still did exist at the university level, right? And within the educational training community, which is why I remember seeing some liberation theology in my training sessions here at my current high school. That's largely where they're kind of contained, through the 90s and into the early 2000s. And then in the early, 2007 plus or so, you start to see a revival of these movements, right? So you do see some liberation blank theories out there today, and trainings out there today, and you do see some critical whatever theories out there today. Right. So the point is, just understand that those are neo-Marxist, right? It's focusing on winning the cultural center, right? That's their goal. Belief if you can win the cultural center, then you can overthrow society as it currently is. Right. Other things that we've already discussed. South Africa, right? So this challenges, about race. We've already talked about apartheid. We've already talked about women's suffrage movement. Women gained, unprecedented access to political and education. This is a different category of analysis, right? This is a new category of analysis. And I don't want to spend on probably already too much time. So I'm just gonna, kind of skim through this, right? So, but I just want to show them to you so that you can pause if you want. If you have any questions about them, please let me know. Literacy rates, average year of schooling. So you guys are mostly 10th graders, right? So you can see which countries, which countries have students on average go beyond that level of education and which do not. And we see adult literacy rates 15 plus, both sexes. All right. Gender ratio for mean years of schooling. All right. So, women gain unprecedented access to politics and education. Is this? This is kind of an interesting one as well. So if we're talking about access to, in this case here, political roles, built into the 1949 Indian Constitution is this idea of caste reservations are guaranteed, certain number of seats. The government has to set quotas to ensure representation for certain groups within India because of the caste system, because of historical, structural discrimination that occurred in India. You see this kind of constitutional protection for those groups, all right? So, in the United States, we might use a term affirmative action, right? So affirmative action programs, because we do have similar programs to this in the United States. One of the differences between the United States and affirmative action and this policy of quotas built into their constitution is that in the United States, our system is based on Supreme Court precedent. And I remember I was a relatively young teacher, probably within my first 5 years or so of teaching, the last time this topic came up to the Supreme Court. So it was in the early 2000s, that this topic of affirmative action with college admissions came up, and it was upheld I believe for like the next 20 or 25 years or so is kind of when they said probably the next time that this topic should be revisited. So it does exist in places outside of India, right? So what are we seeing here? What are the different groups? Scheduled castes, right? So these are your delots, right? So your former untouchables. And this makes up about 17% of the population of India, are guaranteed to have some representation in government, right? Then we see the scheduled tribes as well, so based on geographic largely, right? Based on geography. And then we see these other castes, that eventually get identified as well. This is one of those things where in India today, it's been called into question. And if you're kind of interested in this, I did kind of play this out a little bit. So if you scroll up, all right, let me kind of just show you where it is. If you kind of scroll up from the video, it's under the increased access to political, right, education, political, professional roles. So this topic has come up in India today, and so just kind of find it again, right? So we see the 1989 reforms, right, where the led the government to decide to extend these benefits. So the other backward classes, the OBCs, is actually an extension of this constitutional, right, this constitutional protections for historically underrepresented groups. But this has come up as a controversial thing in recent years, because of kind of take a case study of the Patels and in the Gujarat, right, in the state of Gujarat in the the northwest of India, on the west side of India. So this is an unlikely caste that he's seeking such recognition. They are as a group prominent, successful, wealthy beyond their share of the population, right? So, and but the basic argument or the demand here is that that they be given better access to jobs in education through quotas. They said that there is a myth that the Patels are rich. Right? Only 5 to 10% of the Patels are prosperous. That doesn't make the entire community rich. So if you visit a village, in his home region, you'll see that people don't have enough to eat, and that there's many poor, and that if you look at the farmers, many farmers have had to kill themselves in the past 10 years as a result of debt issues. And there's an argument against these kinds of, once again, to use kind of verbiage in the United States, affirmative action, right? Against these affirmative actions. And many people, who are critical of him, argue that, he's, demanding, something that is actually impossible, and that what he's actually seeking out is the abolition of the system, right? So he's calling attention to it to destroy it, right? Is the actual intention, of this system. So this is something that today, right, it is simply part of Indian politics, right? So who knows what the future is for this, as is the same for affirmative action in the United States. All right. All right. Other examples of so fights for access to education and politics and civil liberties. The College Board gives us is Martin Luther King. And this is a nice, it's always nice to see examples like this on the illustrative examples, the illustrative examples, because these are examples that I know a lot about. So, this is something that you learn a lot about when you're 8th graders. You spend a lot of time on the civil rights movement. So, being able to use this, right, as an example, if you ever have to do an SAQ or something like that on this topic, this is kind of great thing that this is there, because most of you do know a lot about this. Okay, And citing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? Citing the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These are good examples of calling for increased access to to political, right? To political voice. So, all right, other reform movements, right? The environmental movements, right? So, and this is always good to look at, especially the Green Belt movement, environmental movement, how they approach it in the developing world as opposed to the West. All right. So, and of course, here we kind of have two different movements. Greenpeace is a Western environmental movement, and then with the Green Belt movement, right, this is a non-Western environmental movement, right? So Greenpeace goal: ensure the ability, right, Earth to nurture life in all its diversity. Their issues they focus on, climate change, deforestation, overfishing, et cetera, right? In methods, right, promote activism, promote environmental issues, lobbying, governments, funding, right, ecotage, right, ecological sabotage. So, if you need to commit violence, sometimes you need to commit violence, right? Sometimes you need to put yourself in between the people who are destroying the environment, right? And in the environment itself, right? So this is a Western approach, right, to environmental reform. And this is a non-Western, right? So this is a Kenyan group, that works on environmental issues in and around Kenya. And I've already shown you a previous Google slide that had a kind of a pretty in-depth case study on this. So the founder, right, so grew up, in Kenya, get his PhD, from the University of Nairobi. And the goals are to mobilize the community and community consciousness to reduce poverty, environmental conservation, and use trees as an entry point into refocusing attention to environmental change. Also, empowering women is a key component of this as well. Right. All right. In our last little category of analysis is calls for reform. So this is created in 1989. It's not one organization, but it's a collection of 401 organizations in 76 countries. And the goal is to improve the livelihood, of economically marginalized individuals. And you kind of run through the 10 principles of fair trade, right? So if you see stuff labeled as a fair trade product, these are, what does that tell you? That means, when we talked about like Nestle the other day, that they were sourcing their chocolate out of West Africa 10 years ago by groups who were enslaving children in West Africa, and that is part of their supply chain. What fair trade label tells us is that, goods that are being sold in the West are sourced in ways that are not oppressive. That's what fair trade is about. So this is a different way to try to reform the system and to try to eliminate exploitation from the system, by holding everyone accountable on all the different steps of the supply chain. All right, so it's that is another kind of interesting way to try to reform. Right, so not destroying the system, right? Trying to build accountability within the system. All right, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm actually not really going to spend any time on this at all, because this is your homework, right? Your reading. So I'm going to just kind of skip past these, and we're going to kind of move on. I guess I will kind of leave these on here real quick, just so that you can read through. And this is really just kind of strayer summarization, right? So women's liberation, feminists want to challenge societal cultural patriarchy through direct action, right? So equal rights feminists preferred political lobbying and passing of laws, right? So notice there's liberation feminists, right? Kind of Marxist ideological foundations, and then you have equal rights feminists, right? Who tried to kind of work within the system. Right, so there is a difference here. Right, so more radical movements, women's liberation. Right, we are exploited as sex objects, breeders, domestic servants, cheap laborers. We are considered inferior beings whose only purpose to enhance men's lives. Because we live so intimately with our oppressors, we have been kept from seeing our personal suffering as a political condition. Right, the only truth is exaggerated. Right, so this is yeah, it is. All right, so and one thing I kind of always find interesting is the divide that exists between the global feminists and the global South. Global economic development has found expression in different priorities between the global North and the global South, otherwise the international feminist movements. So when we kind of look at the difference between feminism, and I'm just going to kind of show you where I have a lot of this stuff. So if you look at the website and you go to this challenging of gender, feminism in the West, right? There's here's kind of a look at the goals and expressions of Western feminism, right? So liberation for women meant to be aware of their own oppression. They challenge the Miss America contest. They bring about discussion, right, of what it means to be a woman. Of course, the birth control pill is a major component of this as well. Women of color, right, in the West, right, you do see divides in the feminist movement in the West itself, because the concerns of white middle class feminists, are not always aligned with the concerns of women of color. Black women, for example, had always traditionally worked outside of the home, right, and felt no need to be liberated from the chains of homemaking. So the oppression of the housewife, right, is has kind of gender, racial specific aspects to it. And then you see also that feminism in the global South, they are not going to align themselves with the concerns of Western feminists. So I would encourage you to kind of read through this and kind of see what some of the opposition the opposition is to to Western feminism by feminists in the global South. And of course, you can also see some of the structural opposition to the feminist movement and issues that remain in focus even to this day. All right. So anyway, and it's also kind of good to highlight that the women who did rise to positions of power in the global South. Right. So right, in countries who you would not necessarily think would have examples of female leaders do. All right. All right. So that is all for today. Right. So some key takeaways. African nationalists face many challenges in the path towards sovereignty. Right. So feel free to pause and read through this. Feminism. Right. Feminism changed its focus in the mid-20th century, focusing on voting rights and education to equality. Right, to equality. So a split occurs between feminism in the West and feminism in the global South. Right, and it's important to understand those distinctions. So please read through those notes I put on my website. And of course, issues of equality were fought on many fronts. Liberation theology in Latin America, and et cetera, et cetera. All right. So that is all for today. If you have any questions, please let me know. Sapriati.